Welcome to Module 1 of the GRR Technical Training Series. Module AIM. This module provides an overview of the GRR. For stakeholders who only wish to gain a general overview of the GRR, this module sets out the context, aims, application, and key requirements of the GRR without the necessity of having to work through all of the modules. For practitioners who require a more detailed understanding, and are intending to undertake the remaining modules in this training package, this module provides an introduction and an overview of the content of the other modules. Reminders. This is the first GRR technical training module out of 8 in total. Before we begin the overview, it is worth just reminding ourselves about a few basic points. The GRR stands for the Management of Radioactive Waste from Decommissioning of Nuclear Sites, Guidance on Requirements for Release from Radioactive Substances Regulation, which was published in July 2018. The guidance is available on the SEPA website and can also be accessed via a summary on gov.uk. We use the term Radioactive Substances Regulation to cover the relevant legislation, which is different in Scotland from that in England and Wales. Although the legislation differs in detail, it shares common aims. We have written the GRR to fulfil those aims. Finally, please remember that the GRR applies to all stages of a nuclear site's life cycle and that all the requirements of the GRR need to be addressed for the final surrender of a site's permit. About the authors of the GRR. The Environment Agency, Natural Resources Wales, and the Scottish Environment Protection Agency are the environmental regulators for England, Wales and Scotland respectively. These three agencies have jointly produced the GRR. Our sister body in Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland Environment Agency, has not been involved because there are no nuclear sites in Northern Ireland. When we refer to the environment agencies, we, us, or our in this training package, it means the three agencies collectively. Our responsibilities include regulating the disposal of radioactive waste on or from nuclear sites so that members of the public and the environment are protected from harmful effects of ionising radiation. Nuclear decommissioning. The life cycle of a nuclear site extends from its design and construction through operation to the eventual decommissioning and final cleanup of the site. Decommissioning means the dismantling of facilities and structures that have reached the end of their useful lives. Cleanup means treating or removing contamination that may have occurred as a result of any leaks or spills on or around the site. Once an operator has completed decommissioning and cleanup, they will need to apply for their site to be released from Radioactive Substances Regulation. The GRR provides operators with a clear statement of the standards that their site will need to meet to enable the relevant environment agency to release them from Radioactive Substances Regulation. What sort of wastes? The final stages of decommissioning and cleanup of sites will involve managing large volumes of waste, including both radioactive waste and conventional waste. Waste with higher levels of radioactivity will need to be moved into stores, where it will be kept safe and secure until dedicated disposal facilities can be constructed. Most of the waste from decommissioning and cleanup is expected to have fairly low levels of radioactivity. Much of this waste will be made up of things like demolition rubble, contaminated soils, scrap metal, and redundant structures such as foundations and pipes. All of this waste needs to be managed safely and disposed of somewhere suitable. This might be on the site that produced the waste or after transport to another site. Working together with ONR. The environment agencies are not the only regulator on a nuclear site interested in decommissioning and cleanup. The Office for Nuclear Regulation, ONR, is an important partner in this work. ONR regulates safety and security at nuclear sites. That includes nuclear safety and conventional health and safety. ONR issues site licences under the Nuclear Installations Act of 1965, known as NIA 65, to the operators of nuclear sites, and enforces the Health and Safety at Work Act to make sure that employers on nuclear sites ensure the safety of their workers and the public. As part of the process of decommissioning and release from regulatory control, operators will apply to de-license the site so that it is no longer regulated under NIA 65. De-licensing is a separate regulatory process from the release from radioactive substances regulation. We are committed to coordinating our regulation with ONR, and we involved ONR in preparing the GRR. Wider government context. For the past 3 or 4 years, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, BEIS, has been working closely with ONR, the environment agencies and other stakeholders to look at the regulation of nuclear sites during the final stages of decommissioning. After consulting widely, the government has proposed changes to legislation to enable de-licensing of nuclear sites under NIA 65 earlier, when all nuclear safety and security matters have been resolved. The environment agencies will then have the main responsibility for determining when a site has been returned to a satisfactory state. The GRR effectively defines this state and will be used to guide our decisions. This allows a more flexible and sustainable approach to final decommissioning. Note that the GRR is needed whether or not these legislative changes come about. Even if the current nuclear de-licensing arrangements continue, operators will still need to apply for release of their site from radioactive substances regulation, and we will still need a clear statement of our criteria for assessing such applications. Aims of the GRR. The guidance has 3 aims. Firstly, to set out the requirement for optimised plans for the management of radioactive waste from decommissioning and clean-up of a nuclear site. Secondly, to set out the standards that must be met if those optimised plans identify that radioactive wastes are best managed by on-site disposal. And thirdly, to set out the standards that a nuclear site must meet to enable it to be released from radioactive substances regulation. This is the first time that we, the environment agencies, have expressed our expectations for what nuclear site operators need to do to be able to surrender their environmental permits. Applicability of the GRR. The GRR applies to all nuclear sites that hold an environmental permit, whether or not they have already begun decommissioning and cleanup, including civil sites and defence sites, nuclear sites that are decommissioning, operational nuclear sites, and new build nuclear sites. Operators need to plan for the whole lifetime management of their radioactive waste and anticipate eventual release from radioactive substances regulation at whatever point in their life cycle they currently are. The GRR applies to the whole area that is covered by a site's permit, as defined on the map attached to the permit, together with any area beyond the permit boundary that are affected by activities on the nuclear site. For example, if contamination in the ground has migrated beyond the permitted area. All radioactive substances that are in scope of the legislation need to be addressed under the GRR. This includes existing and prospective radioactive wastes and radioactive contamination. Structure of the GRR. The GRR is built around a fundamental protection objective that expresses the overall aim of the guidance, 5 principles that guide operators on how their decommissioning and cleanup activities should achieve this objective, and 15 separate requirements that we have split into management requirements and technical requirements. Fundamental protection objective. Our fundamental protection objective is to ensure that a nuclear site is brought to a condition at which it can be released from radioactive substances regulation through a process which protects the health and interests of people and the integrity of the environment, both during the period of regulation and afterwards, and which inspires public confidence and takes account of costs. 5 principles of the GRR. 5 principles underpin the fundamental protection objective and help operators to understand how the requirements are intended to deliver the objective. The principles are: Principle 1, protection of people and the environment against radiological hazards should reflect the national standards applicable at the time when actions are taken. Principle 2, Optimization should ensure that radiological risks to members of the public and the population as a whole are as low as reasonably achievable, or a LARA, throughout the period of regulation and afterwards. Principle 3. Protection of people and the environment against any non-radiological hazards associated with the radioactive substances should be provided to a level consistent with that provided by the national standards applicable at the time when actions are taken. Principle 4. When the site is ready to be released from regulation, there should be no requirement for human action in order to protect people and the environment. And Principle 5. A process that is open and inclusive should be used to bring the site to a condition at which it can be released from radioactive substances regulation. 15 requirements of the GRR. The 15 specific requirements comprise management requirements and technical requirements. If the operator's plans for decommissioning and cleanup meet the requirements, then the 5 principles and the fundamental protection objective will also be met. All 15 requirements must be met, but this should be done in a way that is proportionate to the scale and complexity of the site, the amount of radioactivity to be managed, and the amount of radioactivity remaining on site, if any. The other modules of this training package cover each of the requirements in more detail. 2 key deliverables of the GRR. At this point, however, it is worth highlighting 2 requirements that require the operator to produce outputs: a waste management plan and a site-wide environmental safety case. A waste management plan, or WMP, is a documented, practical plan that describes the operator's arguments and proposals for dealing with all the radioactive substances on the site or any off-site radioactivity that has arisen from the activities on the site. The waste management plan is where the optimization arguments are made. It should be a holistic and integrated plan for all the wastes and any radioactive contamination. Operators already have many resources that can go into creating the waste management plan. The Site-Wide Environmental Safety Case, or SWESC, is a documented set of claims made by the operator to demonstrate that implementation of the waste management plan will achieve the standards of environmental safety set out in the GRR. The SWESC needs to show that the condition of a site, including any proposed on-site disposals, will be safe for people and the environment, both during and after radioactive substances regulation. There is a strong interdependence between these 2 outputs. The waste management plan needs to be shown by the SWESC to be environmentally safe. If not, then the waste management plan will need to be modified. Therefore, there is potentially an iterative relationship between the waste management plan and the SWESC, which together will eventually provide the demonstration that the requirements of the GRR have been addressed. Crucially, the waste management plan and the SWESC are necessary to support applications made by the operator, whether that is an application to make an on-site disposal of radioactive waste or an application for release from radioactive substances regulation. Possible management options for radioactive waste and contamination. There is a range of possible options for managing radioactive waste and contamination on a nuclear site. Applying the principle of optimization will enable the operator to identify the combination of options that is best for their site. This figure shows the main generic options that could be considered by an operator. They include transfer of waste to a suitable facility elsewhere, disposal on-site in a dedicated facility, disposal in situ in the case of structures such as foundations or pipes, or disposal for a purpose if the waste is shown to be suitable for the necessary infilling of dangerous voids or for use in necessary construction of bunds, roads, or hard standing. Operators must also decide how best to manage any contamination on site. Whatever options operators select, their waste management plan must show that they deliver the best overall outcome for people and the environment. Their SWESC must show a sufficient level of protection of people and the environment. The journey to surrender of an environmental permit. Final decommissioning of a nuclear site could take several decades, or could be even longer if a period of care and maintenance is programmed by the operator. Eventually, final demolition, dismantling and cleanup will complete and the site comes to a point we call the end of all planned work involving radioactive substances. The permit is not surrendered at this point. There will need to be a period of validation monitoring to confirm that the condition of the site is as anticipated in the SWESC. We also recognise in the GRR that there may be a need for what we call a period of control for the purpose of radiological protection. The operator's SWESC may show that the site will require a further period of time for the processes of radioactive decay and natural attenuation to reduce remaining radiological hazards to levels that meet the standards for release. Clearly, the site cannot be released from radioactive substances regulation while such a period of control is required. Controls might include actions to restrict access, such as fencing, signage, or surveillance, or engineering controls such as maintaining drainage systems, or a combination of these or other actions. The operator must demonstrate that the proposed controls will deliver the required protection and that they can be maintained for the duration of the period of control. We have said in the GRR that we are unlikely to accept a period of control of longer than 300 years because of the social changes that occur over this sort of timescale. It is important to recognise, however, that while a permit may remain in place for many years, this does not preclude the site from being used for other purposes. Once the standards set out in the GRR for the period after the end of regulation are met, we call this the site reference state. Once this point is reached, the operator can apply to surrender the permit. Site reference state. The site reference state means that the site is in a condition that is fully compliant with the standards for release from radioactive substances regulation. This means that the three numerical standards set out in requirements R10, R11 and R12 are met, and people are sufficiently protected from the risks from exposure to any remaining radioactive substances due to natural dispersal of radioactivity in the environment, inadvertent human intrusion into buried radioactivity, and natural disruptive processes affecting dispersed or buried radioactivity. Our standards of protection require that there must be no reliance on active measures to protect people after release from radioactive substances regulation. Therefore, the need for any protective controls that rely on future human actions must have come to an end before the site reference state can be achieved. Next steps. This module has provided an overview of the GRR. If you require only a broad understanding, then you may not need to view the remaining modules. However, if you do wish to continue with the more in-depth modules, we suggest that you view Module 2, Optimization, next. Thank you.